me switch myself here. Okay, when I first started doing this, it was many years ago. Actually, the first time that I ever heard about knife painted watercolor was from Clyde Stout at East Valley Artists many years ago. Those of you who were around when I first joined know that back then I was primarily a watercolorist, and I was still trying to get the hang of painting regular watercolors, forget learning how to do them with a palette knife. So I kind of stuck it off into the back of my head. It wasn't until many years later, I was at University Art, and I was talking to Seth Golden about their new watercolor, and he was telling me how it didn't shrink as much as regular watercolor did. And so because of that, he says, you could probably use a palette knife with it, and it wouldn't shrink and crack. And so that kind of stuck in my head that, hey, why don't I try it out to see if it's going to work? And so we were due to go to Monterey. What we did is I took my little watercolor block, it was like 7 by 10, and a pencil and an eraser and palette knife and brushes and so on. And I did a half a dozen paintings or so that were all done with the knife. I did some florals and a seascape and a dune and several other things. And it just turned out really well. I was very happy with them. And so it's something I kind of filed away in the back of my head. And I do them every so often, usually in groups, 3 or 4 at a time. And then I stop for a little while. And you're familiar with the ones that I did a few weeks ago. I did 3 or 4 of them in a row, one right after the other. I had the stuff out, and it was fun, and they don't take a whole lot of time to do, and it's really fun to just kind of cut loose, and you can work from a photograph or you can work from out of your head. Now, you all have the image. The first thing I want to tell you about the image is that the image that you saw, that is a portion of a larger photograph that I took at Monterey about a week and a half ago. This is a much bigger photo, but within the photo, there was this area of it that I thought would make a really cool painting. So I just made a copy of it, cut and cropped it and so on, and got the compositional part of it out of the bigger photo that I wanted, and then made a regular size print of it. So it looks, something like this. And so, like I said, that is a portion of a complete photograph. So that's the first thing. If you're going to work from photographs, you're not going to copy a photograph. You're going to interpret from a photograph. And so anytime you take a picture, you're going to, afterwards, you should be able to find a half a dozen different compositional paintings within one picture if you really look at it. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and start. I'm going to switch here to my little mixing palette camera here. So this is right here where I'm going to be mixing, and I'm going to start with the background color here. So I've got some, Payne's gray and some ultramarine blue together. And obviously you want enough of this color to be able to cover the area you're trying to do. Now, my canvas is only 9 by 12, or my watercolor block's only 9 by 12. So it's not very big. And I'm going to take a palette knife here and start mixing the color together. Now you'll notice if you've got the core watercolor that I'm using, the QOR, it seems thicker and stickier than normal watercolor does. And that's because it's got a synthetic binder in it called Aquazol. And what's cool about that synthetic binder, I think, is that it actually helps to minimize the backgrounds that you have when you're doing watercolor. It actually minimizes those things and ends up looking really nice. You can get into it, let it dry, and come back in. You don't have to worry about it reactivating as much and leaving a background. So it's a little bit more forgiving on that. Okay, so I've got this really nice blue-black mixed up here, as you can see from the camera there. And let's move up here to the painting camera here. All righty.
Jeff, sorry,
Now you can see. You can see the.
In the chat, we have a question if you could repeat the two colors you're mixing right now.
Ultramarine blue and Payne's gray.
Thank you.
Either one of them by themselves is okay, but they tend to dry kind of flat and reflective if you use them by themselves. So I kind of like mixing the two together. So then I've got a 1-inch flat Escoda brush here. I'm going to dip this in the water, get the brush wet, and I'm just going to go straight across this. I'm not worried about a thin wash like I would do for a sky. I just want the color down. I want to cover the paper and do this whole big shadow area. I'm not worried about spattering it. Just going to cover the entire thing with this dark blue black color. I want to keep the paint wet. It's still, you know, hot, kind of dry out there. So the paint's going to dry really fast. I'm not going to need a blow dryer or anything. So this should put a really nice shadow foundation color down for this knife painted watercolor that we're going to do. And it's just these two colors. Now you could, if you wanted to, add in a violet, like a diox violet if you had that, or a mauve or something like that. Even a alizarin if you wanted a little bit more of a reddish violet in there. But I like these, when I'm doing something like this, it's got a lot of deep shadow and a lot of bushes in the foreground. I tend to go with a darker color. And so Payne's gray, as you know, is a blue-black, and ultramarine is a blue. And so blue colors tend to recede. Even though this is very dark, there is a blue bias to all of this, and because it is a blue bias thing, when I put those warmer colors in front, this dark background is going to fall way, way back. And so those other colors are going to stand out really, really well. See, I'm almost down to the bottom of the block now. This is a 9 by 12, 140-pound Arches watercolor block. I actually have like 2 or 3 of these. I have one that's a 10 by or 11 by 15, and a couple that are a little bigger even that I got back in University Art. And so I always have, look at that, ta-da! We've got a nice dark background there. See if I can take care of some of the glare. Using water in there too. I was dipping the brush in frequently to keep the paint really, really wet. There's an area here that I missed. Kept dipping it in there to keep the paint wet because, as I told you, core seems to be a little thicker because of the binder. And so to get it to go across like this in a nice streak without having back runs and so on, to do it evenly, you want to keep the paint really, really wet and go back across it. And this is going to dry out really, really nice. Have a nice blue background to this when it's all finished. And it'll dry really, really quickly. Okay, and that's pretty all I'm going to be doing with that 1-inch wash, unless I decide to do some sort of brush technique with the end of it later on for a bush or something. I'm pretty much done with the 1-inch watercolor brush for now. From this point on, it's going to be pretty much all palette knife, and I'll let this dry a little bit and go ahead and then sketch the next layer of the painting as soon as this is dry. And it shouldn't take too terribly long to get it to dry. Get this nice blue. If you have more blue and it's more blue, less black, that's fine. Like it's more of a royal blue If it ends up being more Payne's gray blue, that's fine too. The whole thing is to get that cool background color down before we start with the knife. The thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to block in, just lightly sketch in where the first break of the bushes are. And it almost looks like it's like an evergreen, brushy, sort of thin evergreen with greens and whites in it that's in the background. And there's a little bit of a shadow area in there too. So I'm just going to lightly sketch in where that's going to be. Don't need a lot of definition because I'm going to have the paint define that. Okay, I've got that top edge done pretty much where that's going to be, and I put it with a white pencil. It shows up with graphite too, but I used a white pencil. You can see it right along in here. Right along this edge right here is where the edge, you can see the other edge of it here. That's where the top of the edge is going to be. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up some of the green color that's there. And let's see, I've got a sap green here. There will be a time here in a little bit where we're going to be using some white, which you almost never do with watercolor. Okay, so we'll use this. And then I'm going to take a little bit of that green and I'm going to add some, just a little tiny bit of Chinese white to that. So here we've got sap green and a tiny bit of Chinese white. I'll show you on the palette here. If you look right here on the palette, up here I've got, this is the sap green, and then right next to that is the Chinese white. And I'm going to mix that together. The green's still a little dark, so I may add a tiny bit of the yellow to that. And mine is a Hansa yellow light. You could also add raw sienna to it. That would be fine. Okay, so this is the Hansa yellow light. I'll take just a tad of that because it's a pretty strong color too. And I'll mix that in. Still need a little bit more of that Chinese white. It's not quite the color I want yet. Okay, so that's better. So it's still a warm green, but there's a little bit of yellow in this and a little bit of white to it too. And so I'm going to go ahead and take my palette knife, switch the screen so you can see the bottom of that too a little better. Okay, the palette knife is right here. You can see I've got the paint on the bottom and the leading edge, but it's not over the entire thing. It's just on the bottom and the edge. And I'm going to start from the top of the bush, and I'm just going to drag some of that green down, and I'm going to let some of that dark shadow color peek through. And I'm coming in at different directions too. So some of it's going to look heavier, So that means it'll, you know, make the bushes look a little bit thicker and heavier too. Just lay your palette knife flat against the block and then just pull it straight down. The cool thing is later on you can actually take a palette knife and put it just on the edge, and you can get really fine details with it too. But right now I'm just doing some really loose green background that is actually shows in that photograph. I'm keeping it very loose. I'm letting some of the other color drop through, show through, and I'm pulling it down too. Pulling it down a little bit lower than it really is, so it will be behind the next subsequent color that I use, which will, this green will be the foundation for that. Also, you know, make sure you kind of go right over to the edge of the block. You can do that. So I've got that green bushy thing in there with the palette knife all the way across, and it shows the first layer of the bushes that are in the background there. It's still fairly dark green. It's got the blue of the paper showing back through the rest of that too. See if I can get a little bit more light in there now. Shouldn't have as much glare, I don't think. There we go, that's better. And so we have this really nice, rich, bushy thing that just happened in a couple of seconds just by going in different directions, varying the pressure with the palette knife. So I've got the blue or the edge of the green bushes there with the shadows showing through with the blue background. And look at how far the background falls back now just by putting that little bit of warm color in front of it. Boom, the whole thing just falls way, way, way back. Really, really nice. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of that yellow. I'm actually going to add a tiny bit of raw sienna to that, which is kind of an earthy yellow. And I'm going to add a bit more of the Chinese white to that. I'm going to lay it right on top of the green. And I'm going to take the same palette knife that I was mixing with, and I'll mix this up now too. And so now I've got a lighter, warmer, lighter green version, but a little warmer because of the raw sienna that's in it, than the stuff that was there. So I'm going to start laying in some vertical strokes to this. And I'm just doing a vertical stroke with a palette knife there. Straight up and down's fine. I'm not trying to copy, just trying to balance the number of little stalky things that are sticking up here. Now when you're doing this, remember to try to keep an odd amount. So always have, instead of having an even amount of something, try to have an odd amount. So 1, 3, 5, 7, those are all going to be better than if it's 2, 4, 6, or 8. The odd number of those elements is actually more interesting compositioning. So now I'm taking some more of that same nice color that I just put vertical streaks in. And I'm doing some drag up with the same color here. So there's some vertical strokes with that. It's coming in front of the other colors that are there, pushing the color that's there because it's greener and it's cooler. It's falling back. The raw sienna is making this greenish yellow come forward. So now we've added another layer, and it's even pushed the background back even further than that. We're not even doing, you know, too much in the way of detail or anything yet either. We're just blocking in these really big, interesting areas with the knife and going pretty quickly with it. You can do large areas, you can do small ones, you can do just a little bit so you have a kind of like a little drag on the color, or you can, press, get the whole bottom of this wet if you want, and do a really solid color all the way across. It's up to you. How much of that you decide to put in there is up to you. Where you decide to put it is also up to you. None of our paintings tonight should be exactly similar. You're all going to put down different strokes in different places. I wanted to show you this. You take the edge of your palette knife, and it'll work with any palette knife because they all come, to a smaller point at the end. If you drag it through wet, thick paint like this, while it's wet, you're going to get little vertical stalks, almost like stems, that you can drag through there. And that'll be helpful when we get to doing some details on the bushes later. So I'm just going to throw some nice little vertical strokes in here. In that, so if you look from the front of this now, it looks like, even though I haven't painted any of the bushes or anything like that in there, we have some what looks like foliage coming forward with foliage behind it, and then the shadow even behind that. So I'm interpreting from the photo, but you can see this is coming forward really, really quickly, and almost this whole surface has been covered too. Now we're getting into a warmer, darker green, and it's more broken. And so I'm going to start with that same green, but I'm going to add some like sienna, and I'll add some more Chinese white to it, maybe even some of that raw umber to it as well. Let's see. Because I want a warmer green now, I may move a little bit of that blue into it as well. We'll see. I can use French ultramarine because it's basically a warm blue. It's got a reddish bias to it. Green, let's put that in there. Okay, so I'll mix that up now too. Taking that same color here, and I've added like a brown color to it. And then I'm going to heighten that with a little bit of the raw sienna. I tried to keep the colors down too for this particular painting, so it wouldn't cost a fortune for those of you who wanted to paint along. So this is a really minimalist palette. We're just using a few colors here. And so based on that same green, just adding different amounts of raw umber now and raw sienna, I've got this nice dark green. I'm going to take my palette knife in here too. Now the bushes that are in front are a little bit shorter, stockier, and they're bushier. And so I'm going to make a little, almost like crisscross techniques with these. And they're not going to be the same kind of strokes. They're going to be more short. They're going to be more crisscross to kind of suggest leaves. We'll get more into the details of the leaves here as we go. But this is so much fun throwing color around here. You get the overlaps this way too. You can see how this warmer, darker green now is coming in front of the other colors that are there. It's warmer and darker because of the brown that's there. Now I didn't add, burnt sienna to this, but I mean, we could have, I could very well have easily said, hey, use burnt sienna too. Any earth colors for something like this are just fine to use. But again, I wanted to keep the color choices to a minimum. So I'll add a little bit more yellow because I want it to be a little warmer. There we go. So I come back in with this, and Now the paint is going to be thick too. And so that thick watercolor, like an acrylic almost, it's going to have to dry. And that's why I'm kind of want to do big areas first, kind of get this scrape in here, and then give it a little bit of time to dry before we come back in and do like detail techniques of individual bushes and leaves and that kind of stuff. I just want to block in so we have like a foreground, middle ground, background, and keep this really nice and fast and loose. You can even see there, it's really looking very much like foliage. Again, you can use little scraping techniques in here too if you want. Use the point coming through here and there. Down to the bottom of the painting on this first pass on here, almost all the way down to the bottom. It's cool to just bring down a little bit here. Yeah, put some of that shadow back in. That's it. So in here, it looked like it was getting a little bit too uniform, so I actually cut in some darker color in here too, back in there. That's fine, just so it doesn't look all the same, and so that darkness actually helps a little bit. So I'm going to go right down to the bottom. A little bush, side to side, little angular, thicker strokes of paint on this warmer green. So when that's done, I should have an area that's at least 3 layers thick. It's going to look like shrubbery or bushes, and it does. You can see that on the screen. It's already looking like dimension there. It resembles the photograph, even though I haven't painted really any individual details yet, just using the color, just blocking it in. And I'm going to take that right down to the bottom, and I'm going to add some of that dark color back to the bottom of this, and I'll add a little bit of the raw umber to that too. And the reason for that is so it anchors the bottom, the base of the painting. So the front part of the painting should be the warmest and the darkest. Warm, dark colors come at you. And so if you do that at the bottom of the painting, you start working those warm, dark colors into the foreground, that's automatically, one, it's going to anchor all of this green that's there. But by putting those warm, really dark colors at the bottom here, doing those little brushy strokes, those darker colors are going to anchor the rest of it. Again, I'm using Core, but this will work. Same technique will work with Winsor Newton or Daniel Smith. You just aren't going to use the paint, or you can't use the paint quite as thick, because those, if you put on too thick, they may crack. But the Core stuff's not going to. It's going to, I can really just slather this on really super thick if I want. I do not need to worry about it getting too thick. Okay. And take some little dry color and go back up here a little bit and have it very broken and open. Use slightly, yeah, a little bit more background color there. So yeah, this is at a point where we're at first dry. You can see this happen very, very quickly, maybe about 20 minutes, and the whole surface has been colored and it already or covered, and it already looks really, really bushy already. Very, very much so. It's still too bright over there. Okay. So I'm going to let this dry back a little bit because you still need to worry about when you're doing something like this. You still have to, because it's watercolor, if it's too wet and you try to put too much too soon, you can get mud. And so right now, all of these colors are bright and they're vibrant, and I'm not getting mud. So I'm going to let them dry back a little bit at this point before I start putting in some more specific techniques with this. So how is everybody else's stuff coming along? Let's hold up some of your guys' stuff and let's see. And I'm going to pull this out of the way a little bit more. It's got some of the window glare on it now, but might be able to see better. Still not.
Me. Natasha, that looks beautiful.
Thank you.
Gorgeous. Really nice. And you've got that nice, loose, airy green thing on the background too. And it's so much fun with a palette knife like that. How are you painting too?
Yeah, I don't have no watercolor mediums, so but I'm learning.
Okay. It's really fun to do this. Now the thing is, because of where the sun is coming through my window in the afternoon, I have to pull these drapes closed so I don't get the glare on the painting. And I've only probably got about another 10 minutes of that where I have to worry about it. But the other problem is that when the curtains close, it kills some of the light that's available for the camera. So
Okay.
it gets fuzzy like this a little bit, but that should go away when the sun pulls down behind the trees, which is only going to be a few minutes. And then I'll move the curtain out of the way. It should be no fuzziness, should be a lot clearer. Now,
Jeff,
I'm going to do some of these stock. Yes. You have a question?
what's the difference between Chinese white and other whites you use?
Okay, it's a good question. There's three main kinds of white out there, and they come in oil and watercolor and acrylic. Now, traditionally for watercolor, if you see a tube of white, most places it's Chinese white. Chinese white is kind of a warm white. It's kind of a yellowy white. It's not completely white. Titanium white, and there are some, I know Winsor Newton makes a titanium white watercolor. I think Daniel Smith does too. They're really, and Core does, titanium white's really super heavily pigmented. So if you want to do a white by itself, or you really want to really high key out a color and make it a really bright tint, titanium white's the one that you want to use. But let's say you want to just subtly tint a color, but you don't want to really make it super bright. Then you want to use what's called zinc white. It's also called mixing white, and sometimes it's called soft mixing white. Those are colors, or that's a white that you can mix in with a color, and then the more the white you add, it'll give you a slightly lighter tint, but you get a whole range of tints before it looks like it's white. It's a transparent white, and so you can lightly tint a color. Let's say it's a full-on blue, add a little bit of zinc white to that, and it's a little lighter blue, a little bit more zinc white, it's a little lighter blue, and so on. You can get a whole range of light blues with zinc white. You do the same thing with the same blue with titanium white, mix the same amount in there. The first color that you do on titanium is going to be like 8 layers down on the other zinc white. That's how quickly the titanium white will dominate the color. It's really amazing. So if you want to use a white by itself, like a highlight or a really bright area, or you really want a strong influence to a color, titanium white's the way to go. If you want a more subtle color, then to mix a color, to make a tint, then you want zinc white or mixing white. And Chinese white is kind of in between. It's not as pigmented as titanium white, but it's more pigmented than zinc white is, and it has a little bit of a warm bias, which is why I put it down for the list, because these whitish, greenish blossoms that are there in this painting would be really nice. Once I get my green color down, I can take some of that Chinese white and possibly even a little bit of blue in there to get that pale green, almost a mint green white color, to do those little stalks.
So Chinese white comes in acrylic too?
Yes, comes in
Oh, okay.
acrylic, comes in watercolor. Now it depends on the brand. When you get to acrylics, you're going to get usually zinc white or mixing white and titanium white. But I think Winsor makes a Chinese white.
Yeah, because tonight is the first time I hear Chinese white, so that's why I was
Well,
curious.
the main reason is it's usually in watercolor as opposed to acrylic. And the main difference, if you, let's say you didn't have Chinese white, but you wanted to do it in acrylic, what you could do is you could take some titanium white and you could add a little tiny bit of raw sienna into a titanium white, just a little bit, mix it up, and then you're going to get something that's going to be very close to a Chinese white. Let's see if I can put some studio light in here that'll help with the color here. Does a little bit for the camera fuzziness, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start mixing in with that green, some white and a little bit of yellow into the same green that I had in there. So I can do a paler green. It needs to be whiter already. I can look at that and say that's not light enough. So I need to go ahead and add some more to it. This is kind of the fun part for me too, is when you go to that next color. I love mixing up colors and figuring out, okay, I know what happens if I mix these two together. But what happens if I throw this in? Like I did a background color for an acrylic painting I was working on for my other class yesterday. And I used, I think, 5 or 6 different colors. They were all analogous, but I was using like 5 or 6 different colors to get the color that I wanted. And it was really, really nice. This nice, deep, almost reddish brown black. Very, very, very nice. Okay, that's better. Not any glare from the sun anymore. We've got some studio light in here too, and it's not quite as fuzzy. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some of those stalks. Now, if you notice in the picture, the main stalks of that are right in the middle. So kind of put them out of your head or move them off to the side, but you don't want them right in the middle. So I'm going to take some of that color first off, and I'm going to put it on the edge of my palette knife, right on the edge here, and I'm going to put a thin line of color here with the palette knife. You barely see it, but there's a little line of color right there where I put my palette knife down. And so that's going to stick up a little bit higher. And I'm going to dab this in kind of like side-to-side strokes, because that's the way the leaves on that particular bush look. And they kind of have like a little upward slant to them too. So you can do that with the knife after you put the color down. You can actually pull the paint up and get a nice point to it. And you can get a little bushiness to it too, just by laying side-to-side strokes in there. Now I'm going to put 3 on this side, I think.
Jeff,
Yes,
besides white, what add to the white?
I added a little tiny bit of Hansa yellow to that green that I'd already mixed up.
Okay.
And so I got this really nice light green. Now, if I wanted to get like a sharper point, let's say to those bushes, I can use, and that's why I said put a small brush in there. I can put a brush in there and do some like little strokes of color using a small round brush to do some of the stops. I don't want them all the same size, obviously. Some of them are shorter, so I think I'm going to put like 5 on this one side. They're going to come down to different places and so on too at the bottom. So I'm putting 5 of those, and the stalks are in there right now. So I can do little side-to-side strokes with the brush too, but I can also do it with the knife. So if you want to, can't get the detail that you want with the knife, this is where that round brush comes in handy because you're coming back in to do the details. Also, there's going to be some, branches in the back that are going to be sticking out here and there, and you can just come in and throw in almost like rigger work brushes back or branches back in here. That have leaves and stuff on them too. You just dab over in places. So now you have a bushier looking plant back there with green that you can adjust later. So I'm going to go ahead and finish putting in some of these bushy stalks. Some on the other side now too, and maybe closer to the front. And maybe this one's a little fatter. Maybe these two are a little fatter and a little taller maybe. Yeah, that's going pretty cool so far. Now, again, there's some bushiness that's in here too. So I can take some of that green that we had mixed up already that's still sitting there. Now, remember, the green, it's not like acrylic. When green paint dries on your palette, you can get it wet again and it turns right back into green watercolor paint. It's not like an acrylic. So I can take some of that light green and take some of the darker green that I had in there, and I can put in some bushier shrub techniques in front of those stalks that I put in there. And that's going to come in, make some really interesting textures in here too.
Hey, Jeff,
Yes.
when you get in a second, would you be able to maybe try to bring the surface to the camera a little bit so we can see some of the details, and the color also is a little bit hard to see the difference of green.
Sure. Let me go ahead and do
All I see is black and white.
the camera. You lose a little bit of detail there. You can get to see the color starting to build up there at the bottom, the textures of the plants and so on. The details are going in here. Now I still have lots of leaf techniques to do in the foreground too, but I want to finish getting the stalky bushes in there first.
Thanks. And I think there's a question in the chat too. Let's see.
Okay.
There was one. Does gouache have the same kind of effect as this type of watercolor?
The gouache is kind of an opaque watercolor, so you could use, you probably use opaque or gouache. I've never tried it with gouache before. Now, again, you have to realize gouache is very opaque, So that is a good thing. Everything you put down is going to cover another color that's there. It's kind of a good thing. It actually covers up, so that good. You can actually cover up mistakes that way too. But I don't know what gouache would do as far as cracking if you put the paint on too thick. Now, some of these stalks almost have like, it looks like there's almost like a little bit of a violet tint to them. I'm not going to worry about that too much. I think what I'll do is I'll make a yellow tint to some of them.
By the way, that's a Nithra by Innis.
Excuse me?
That's a Nithra.
Small white balloons that are in here at the bottom. Now you can do spattering technique if you want that, but I'm going to go ahead and just dab in little round areas of this whitish green in places, not everywhere, but just in places. And then I'm going to add some that's just pure white too. Some pure white colors there. I'm just going to add pure titanium white to it, not titanium, Chinese white. And I'm just using the tip of palette knife when I do that. And that's starting to put in some of the foreground flowers. I'm just going to put in little dabs. Small flowers, you can just do little teeny touches like this, like it shows there. See this now? Just touch the palette knife here and there. And so you see these little white flowers popping up in the foreground over here. Just pure white, and some of the others are green white. And so there's some variation there. It doesn't get lost in those other colors. It ends up being like an accent. In front of a clubhouse in this place that we were staying in Monterey at Pajaro Dunes. And the area in front of the clubhouse has all of these really cool bushes and plants. I mean, not only do you have all of these different flowers there, but right in front of it, there's different kinds of lupin and golden poppies. And I mean, it's really quite breathtaking just to walk through there. And so I took a lot of really quick reference shots, but this is, like I said, a top corner area of one of the pictures I took. And so there are picture within this same exact photo that we're working from here. I could use another area of that photo and do a different painting from it. The strokes and everything would be something that people could get done with their palette knife fairly quickly too. So I'm starting to get these nice little bushy effects there. There are some sticks that are in there too. So I'm going to take some of that raw umber that I have down here and I'm going to mix it in with a little bit of the yellow. So I'm going to get this kind of brownish okay, that's good. And we want some of these branches to just do a very light touch with this brush, and I'm just using the very tip of that brush. Pulling it off almost like you'd use a rigger brush. Leaves that way too. Because some of these little branches just stick up in the back there, and there's some brown to them as opposed to yellow. So I can actually take some of those same colors that we've been using, mix some white back in with the green, add some green back in with the white, and I can actually use the brush to do some of the details on these flowers now, and just remember they kind of have an upward stroke to them. So this is where you can use that number 1 or number 2 round to do some small strokes sideways on some of those flowers. So they end up looking more dimensional, and they're not going to all be the same, obviously. They're not going to be the same. Some of them are going to be a little bit different. Some will be wider. Some will be a little bit less so. You can actually use some raw sienna and use that as a bloom color too. If you add a little bit of white to it, you get this nice pale yellowy color to that. If you add some raw sienna to your Chinese white, you'll get kind of this nice yellow, earthy yellow white that's there that you can put in here and there on the stalks of some of those branches. Some little yellow, white dabs in here towards the center. And that gives some actually more texture and some more interest into the center of the painting there. And we're starting to see different layers of blooms here now too. I've got some that are off-white, some that are white, some that are yellow. In fact, let's put some more yellow out there too in places. Now I'm using this yellow on one of these stalks. Keeping it very loose. Notice where I'm holding the brush, holding it like almost all the way at the end of the brush. That's where you need to hold the paintbrush, even if you're doing it in acrylic. Believe it or not, you have more control over it that way than if you have it like right up close on top of it. Holding it back towards the end, much, much easier to control the lines and everything. Okay, I'm gonna add some more brown to this. I'll add some white to that as well. Some of that original dark color that we had. It's nice dark brown. Mix some that nice white color up in that. So putting in some of the more details that are close by, but a little bit further away. Changing the colors up so they're not all the same color. Some of them are a little bit more white, some of them are longer, some of them are bushier. Some of them I'm going to add some leaves to. But I want to have some just nice stick strokes in here too. Going up there and gives me a little bit more texture to deal with. And so just throwing those things in there with the brush here and there, starting to get some detail. I think this is a little too thick. I can come back in and thin this out a little bit. Can charge in shadows here further too. If I think the shadow is too deep or not deep enough someplace, you can bring that green back in there too. Okay, so I'm going to start doing some more foreground stuff with the knife, using the green, using the brown. And I'm going to try to do like little leaf shapes. And so I'll need some more of the regular green that's there. That's it right here. So I've got some more of the little nice sap green color there. And I'm going to take that, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to the pencil yellow that's there. The yellow out some of those, that green a little bit, so it's a little brighter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like little leafy techniques on some of those foreground bushes here. To do that, I can just use the tip of the palette knife, using some of the yellow, some of the green that's in there, and you just do these little scoop shape areas for the leaves. Just little, using the top of a palette knife blade. Some of them would be broader, some would be more narrow. But they end up looking really, really nice. You can add more greens to those too. And even make darker leaves. Add some of the blues to those leaves that are in the foreground there as well. Stuff to go on it too, but we're talking, it's just been just under an hour while we've been, you know, chatting with each other and everything too. So it's a really wonderful way to paint. And I can let this dry, and I usually do. I will get this to a certain degree and I'll let it dry back, and then I will come in and I'll actually put in some little individual blossoms here and there. There's some nice yellow blossoms, so I'll actually paint in with a brush some little tiny, I'll use like a 1 or a 2 brush, and I'll sit there and brush in some little teeny tiny flowers and leaves right in the foreground as I'm doing this. It really makes the painting pop. Remember, when things are closer to you, they are more detailed, as well as being warmer and darker. So when you're doing the foreground elements, you want to make sure that you add more detail to that. That can actually make a painting that's very close in value throughout if you add larger sizes and more details to the color that's there. It's actually going to make it look more realistic, because the shapes and the colors, or the shapes and the details, are actually going to make those foreground shapes stand out more. About doing this with watercolor, you say, oh man, I screwed up or something like that. When you're doing a knife painting, you can just cover it up.
Right.
Sometimes you're like, oh no, I've got a background, or I've got this weird, or maybe you glopped a different or wrong color paint in the wrong place, and say, okay, I'm going to put a rock in it now because there's nothing else I can do with that. Or I'm going to make it a cat, or this one's going to have a bat, or whatever it is, because you end up making a mistake and you have to try to make something out of it, make it work. So this is really starting to come together, starting to have nice depth to it. Really, see, that's the other thing you can do with this too. I did an acrylic painting that way just as a lark, and I posted it online, where I wet the canvas with a squirter bottle, and
Oh,
then
wow.
I just started throwing wet color onto the wet canvas and just let it run. And I had to try to control the flow of the water and everything. But cool thing is, when it was all said and done, it was a good foundation for what I wanted to do with the painting later on. Really, really nice. So I've been doing a lot of experimentation with different things. There's certain things you can do certain things a certain way. And so what I've been doing is saying, okay, I know I can do this. What if I do this?
Yep.
And just play around with it and see what happens. If you wanted to, towards the very end, you could bring in like an X-Acto knife, and you could actually scrape out areas too. You could go ahead and scrape out nice white areas with an X-Acto knife if you wanted to.
Oh, that's
Watercolor.
Yeah, I've got a little snap knife here so I can show you that. I want to put some more color in here first. Hold on. Yeah, I wanted that little yellow raw sienna color scraped over the middle here and there. Makes it a little earthier, gives a little bit more color interest there. Let's see. Let's go out this way. We want more of that yellow. So when you're working with a knife like that and you see something, oh, that works, and something doesn't work, you can let it dry and then just paint right back over it. So I'm throwing on some thicker paint here, some raw sienna here and there, and it adds something to it. You can see that just at the top, adding that little bit of color here and there with the palette knife and chasing it throughout the block kind of subdues the dominant green that was throughout the whole thing, making it look a little flat. Now there's some little color popping through here and there. Really kind of like that. So I'm glad I threw in the raw sienna here and there with the knife. Okay, so yeah, that adds in some nice warm color into this now, all throughout the entire thing. This middle part here needs to be a little bit lighter. I can take some of that light green that I had, I can scrape that back in if I think that area is too dark. Okay, just cover that right up again. Yeah, that's better. So you can see where I scraped some of the branches out too with the tip of the knife. You can do that with the wet paint, pull it off in different directions, and it will expose whatever dark colors underneath. So you get those branch techniques. So this is starting to look better. You guys wanted to see now, what if I wanted to take some area? I could take you want to make sure the paper's dry when you do this. You can take a snap knife or an X-Acto knife, and when there's an area here, let's say you want to scrape out a white area, you can lift this out so it gets the grain and just lift. You have to cut through the color you put down, but you'll actually scrape, there we go, a nice little white area out of that. Get up underneath all of that color and just scrape it off and snap down and pull back. You get these little teeny white sparkles. Pull it right off onto the paint and you get these little teeny tiny, you can see it right there in the middle where I was messing around with the knife. There's one right here too. Sit there and just push down and pull back and you get these little teeny tiny scratches. There's another one that I just put in there that finally got through all of the color, and you get these little white sparkles throughout the entire thing. And now that this is drying back, by putting that warmer color in here, it actually looks like there's more depth in there than there was before. Instead of it all being up front, it looks like there's an extra layer that's there, so it really has a nice third dimension to this. So I'm at the point where I'm going to let it dry, and then once it's dry, I'll come back in and I will put in some more detail techniques for this. I hope everybody's painting is coming along pretty well too. It's about all I can do for right now until this dries back. I hope you guys enjoy it.
That's
So you already
totally
put in the big leaves, which I haven't done yet. But you've got big leaves in the foreground, and you've got some big violet flowers. And I've still been messing around with the kind of the bushy middle ground and so on through this.
Yours is gorgeous.
That it really is cathartic. You can sit there and play with it and say, okay, what happens if I do this? And sometimes when you do that, you go, nope, not going to do that again. And if you do it, you can cover it up or wipe it off. It really doesn't matter. But this has got a lot of, I've still got big foreground leaves that I can put in here and blossoms. So let's see what everybody else has.
What does yours look like?
Thank you.
Oh, yes, that's, Hadi made a great point. Talk
Yes.
when you hold up your painting so that people can see you.
Actually, this is first time I'm doing the palette knife with the watercolor.
Did you enjoy doing it?
It's a special, like different experience. Yeah, it's little difficult, but yeah, I'm enjoying. Yeah,
It's
thank
something
you.
that's new. It takes some getting used to.
Yeah, because
I've been doing it
are
on
we
and off
allowed
now
to
for
use?
about 6 years.
Are we allowed to use water while doing this or
Sure.
no?
Yeah, you can use water. You can use brush with it too. Cheetah, let me see.
Yeah, this is mine.
Wow, yours went much bluer and brighter than everybody else's too. So I really like it too. It's very bright. Nice and
Thank
colorful.
you. Thank you. I'm thoroughly enjoying doing it. Very nice. Thank you so much.
Wow, look at Kalpana's over there. I love all of the browns and whites and blues in there. It's very cool.
Yes, I think we just got a great idea.
I can't because I don't have the gallery view.
Oh, okay.
I can do it.
Sarah can do it. Okay, everyone hold theirs up together and let Sarah take a picture.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, and